Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Inquire, the show that aims to bring people together from across a wide range of different worldviews in order to explore ideas and share life. I'm your host, Jez Field, and in today's episode, I'm really excited to be joined by my good friend Rich Tutt, who is a local church pastor. And this is going to be the first of a two-part discussion with Rich, looking at the Bible's creation account in the first couple of chapters of the book of Genesis. In this first episode, the idea is that Rich is going to lay out his own answers to questions about Genesis, creation, science, evolution, that sort of thing, and share what he thinks is some truth that offers a valuable insight into our human condition and some explanation stories of where we've come from. And the origin of the species, etc. And then, as a response to that, our good friend Paul Frost is going to have a chance to reply to Rich and grill him. So I hope you're looking forward to that. Well, I am. Should be a good discussion. Hopefully, we'll all grow in our understanding and appreciation of the world. So, Rich, welcome. It's great to see you.
Thanks very much. Nice to be here, Jeff.
Well, Rich, to kick things off, why don't you tell us what is one of your life's greatest discoveries?
My latest discovery is gin and tonic. It's just phenomenal. I got into it a little while ago. I've never drunk it my whole life, and I was away on holiday, and it was like all drinks included. I thought, well, I'll give it a try. I've got mates who love it. And I thought, yeah, this is all right, not brilliant. And I went around to my mate's house and said, give me one of your G&Ts. And I drank it. I'm not joking. It was like Damascus Road. It was like, this is phenomenal. I've never tasted anything like it.
Oh, that's so good.
For days and days afterwards, I couldn't stop thinking about it. So it was just but I suspect that's not slippery slope. Yeah.
Slippery slope to addiction, I think.
Yeah. Literally, no exaggeration. I spent about a week walking around thinking, when can I get another one of those? They were incredible.
Wow.
So, yeah.
To kick things off, why don't you tell us when you became a Christian, or certainly when the book of Genesis and the Bible became an authoritative source of influence in your life, and how you went from beyond just a kind of surface level, like, well, I know the creation accounts in the Bible, to thinking more deeply about it and reading more broadly around the subject of creation and belief.
Sure, okay. Well, I became a Christian when I was 17, and was born again into a really good church. And there was my first encounter with Genesis, really, would probably the guy that did my kind of, new Christian youth kind of discipleship stuff was a full-on, 6-day literal creationist. And so that got filtered into the normal, read your Bible, pray, share your faith, don't sin, those kind of things. So I just assumed it was part and parcel of normal Christianity. I thought this is what it is. And so I read, and he would dish out literature on it now and again and talk about it. But it was only probably a couple of years later, having, read a lot of that kind of literature, having read Genesis itself a number of times, obviously, and looked into the Bible, that I started sort of asking questions about it on a textual level. Is this actually the only way to understand it, or can you think about it in a different way? I won't pretend it's been like a huge, like, burning life's quest for me, because I like the Bible. I read the Bible a lot. I look into the whole Bible. But over the years, I've had all sorts of different opinions of the book of Genesis, and in particular, kind of the creation account, Genesis 1 to 3. And probably two landmark kind of moments in my thinking about Genesis came. One, when I read it in Hebrew for the first time and thought, this doesn't feel like it feels when you read it in some English translations. There are some bits that feel very different when you read it in Hebrew. And actually that was true for the whole book of Genesis. It was a revelation reading the whole thing through in Hebrew to me. And the other way was to say, when I sort of said, let's not think, how do I fit the science and the text together, which is the classic way of trying to approach it, but saying, how do I fit the text itself together? So some of my biggest reasons for having a different reading in the book of Genesis now than what I used to are not because I've interacted with the science versus faith debate, but because I'm interacting with the internal textual evidence of Genesis 1 and 2 itself and saying, I'm not sure this should ever have been read in the way that I used to read it because of purely textual reasons rather than external scientific reasons. So that's probably my journey so far. I'm not saying I've got the right answers and I'm there, but I think it's interesting.
I mean, we do kind of have to start with what I think seems to be most people's initial reaction to an objection to the Bible, which is, as you said, the science versus faith debate that people throw up. I mean, before you were a church pastor, you were a physics teacher, is that right?
I was a maths teacher. I did a theoretical physics degree at university, then did some youth work with the church, and then I was a maths teacher for 10 or 12 years, something like that.
So, I mentioned that to say you've never been someone who's opposed to science or has a particular problem with science. And yet for most people, when they hear people talk about the Bible's creation account, they dismiss it instantly from the basis of science. And they find the idea that someone can believe in God incredulous in a society like this, where we rely so heavily on science to guide our understanding of the world. But you haven't felt that as a major tension in your reading of the book. And I mean, you alluded to you're reading it in Hebrew, which I guess is something that not many people are able to do in our society. But let's start there. Your teacher's experience is the experience of a lot of non-Christians, especially when they come across Christians who talk about the book of Genesis, is the Bible, people saying the Bible says the world is only 6,500 years old, and Christians saying the book of Genesis is the creation account in Genesis is a literal 7-day creation. If you don't believe this, you're wrong, and science is wrong. And so a lot of people instantly are put off from considering what the Bible's message might be for today, because they come across that kind of speech. How do you interact with that discussion, and why do you not land in the same place?
I think it's a very unhelpful discussion, because I think as soon as you start, usually, I mean, we see this in politics nowadays, don't we? As soon as you start polarizing things, you move further away from understanding than closer. So I'm a big, as you said, I'm a big fan of science. I did my degree. I do keep up with kind of scientific goings on, because I think science is phenomenal. How amazing and how beautiful it is, some of the discoveries we've made about how the universe works, how animals work, how the brain works. I mean, it's astounding. If you go down the kind of anti-intellectual route that some people of faith would do, to say, no, that's all wrong, I think you're naive at best, because and sometimes Christians even get into this thing of, there's deliberate conspiracy that, the scientists, they really know the evidence points to it, but they're hushing it up. And you just think, I don't think you can say that if you've ever engaged in any kind of formal academic scientific training. Now, I know there's people that would argue against that, but so I think it's the false dichotomy. I also think it's false to say, let's just throw out this entire book because the first few chapters seem to be difficult to us when we look at it. Surely the approach is to say, science is the interpretation of observed physical phenomena that allows us to construct theories about the way existence is and the way it works. In the same way, our understanding of the Bible is an interpretation of what's been written down and recorded in the past. And if those things don't fit, it's not necessarily pick one and throw the other away. Maybe we've misunderstood one or the other, or both. And my position is, I believe the Bible, I believe it's the word of God, and I believe it's true, but I believe we need to understand what it actually wants to tell us, not what we think it wants to tell us. And so my reading of Genesis 1 to 3 is not that at some point an ancient Hebrew sat down and said, I'm going to answer the question, how did all this start and when? But I think it's an ancient Hebrew who's sitting down answering the question, why is life like this? Who are we? And why do we experience life in the way we do? And I think he's written this, what you could call a creation account, to answer that question, rather than the question of, if I went back far enough in my calendar, when would I find day one? And if I was observing it in a lab coat with a notebook and writing down what happened, what's the step-by-step guide to kind of constructing a universe? So that's my take. I think it's answering a different question.
I mean, that seems, or some people could say that is a Christian's backpedaling in the face of science. And Christians have always believed that the Bible says that the universe is 6,000 years old. But since the 1960s, Christians have had to backpedal because of Big Bang Theory or Darwin in the late 19th century. Christians have had to backpedal, and now it seems to be convenient that you're able to reread this text that other people have read that way for thousands of years. What would be your response to that?
Well, first of all, it's not true that Christians have universally read it as a six-day creation account for the last 2,000 years. We've got some of the early church fathers who are commenting on these exact chapters of Genesis, some of which are Augustine talks about them as being school days rather than literal days. It's a way of God presenting something for us to help us understand it. It slips my mind exactly, but I think Origen is also dubious about referring to this as literal days of creation that you could kind of, clock in and clock out with a stopwatch. So first point is it's just not true. And the second point is the Christian position is we want to understand what God has revealed to us in his Bible, which means we always keep asking the question, does what we understand by it stand up? And great breakthroughs have happened in church history, such as the Reformation, for example. And maybe you could even include the kind of Azusa Street Pentecostal revival, when people have actually said, hang on, let's push back a little bit on the received wisdom about what the church believes and actually look to the Bible and say, but have we missed something? Have we got something slightly wrong? And so I think, number one, they didn't universally believe that, and they haven't through church history. But even if they had, that doesn't mean we can't push back and say on the basis of the Bible's text itself, maybe we've misunderstood it. So for me, if there was no scientific evidence against, I know it's easy to say this, but if there was no scientific against the Genesis creation account, from the strength of the text alone, I would struggle to read that as a literal six-day account, because I think there's so many bits in the text that seem to suggest otherwise.
Well, I mean, that might be a good place to take it next, is maybe to even hear the text read, because a lot of people enter into a discussion like this with the headlines. The Bible says that the universe is 6,000 years old, or the earth is 6,000 years old, and immediately you get turned off. But actually, you're right. In hearing the text, we can form our own opinions. Do you have it to your hand, or shall I read it?
Yeah, you go for it, Jez, if you've got it. Yeah, I've got it with me, but you go for it.
No, because you have your own Rich Tutt translation from the Hebrew.
No, I'm just looking at the NIV here, which does a decent job. I mean, they're all good, aren't they? The translations are all good.
Well, take it away. You read for us.
Okay, so we'll start at Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. We'll come back to it, but really interesting things in that first few lines. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. Let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the lesser light to govern the day, the lesser light to govern the night, and the greater light to govern the day. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth, and to govern the day and night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, let the waters teem with living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the water in the seas and let the birds increase in the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I will give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he'd made, and it was very good. There was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he had rested from all the work of creation that he had done. And that's probably a good pause.
Yeah, well read. So yeah, what are your initial comments and reflections on reading that to help people understand and make sense of it?
I think, first of all, you would have to be blind or deaf not to understand that as being some kind of semi-poetic structure. The fact that you've got the kind of repeated refrains in there, God said, and it was so, it was evening, it was morning, third day, fourth day, etc., etc. It's clearly designed with style in mind. It's designed to be something that you can memorize, that can categorize it, but also has a certain aesthetic appeal. So I think that's the very first thing. It doesn't read like someone stood by, as I said earlier, with a notebook in a lab coat, jotting down what would happen. So that's the first observation I think is important to make from it. I think the second observation I would make from it is if you choose to read it sequentially, you run into a number of problems. So we seem to have water and earth or land knocking around in verse 2, even though that doesn't seem to be created until later on when he separates water and land and creates sea and things. We seem to have day and night appearing very early on, much earlier than light seems to appear, and much earlier than the sun and the moon seems to appear. You've got plants springing up on the earth before there seems to be light. So if you choose to take that as a sequential reading, and I know amongst people who would hold to a kind of theistic evolutionary position, they would very much make a play of, oh, the order is the same as the rough order of evolution, in that we get life appearing in the sea and plants develop into animals, onto the land, developing ultimately into human beings. You say, yeah, with a broad brushstroke, that does work. But when you actually look in detail at what the text says, you get a number of things where things appear to happen before they should happen according to the text, which is the second clue that perhaps we're not supposed to read it following down a strict pattern. And the third and final thing I think is worth saying at the start is there's a well-recognized scheme that you can divide these kind of 6 active days into, whereby on day 1, God is forming an environment, and on the corresponding day, so day 1, day 4, God is filling the environment he's created. So day 1, we get, it says light separates from darkness, and then on day 4, we get the sun, the moon, the lights, the stars in the sky to mark the times. That in itself tells you something, doesn't it? Hang on, day 4, he's saying this is to separate days and seasons. Well, how was he doing it in the first 3 days? And then you get day 2, let's separate the waters above, the waters below. And then he's going in the corresponding day across there. He fills the sky with birds and he fills the waters with living animals. And then we get on day 3, he forms the land by separating the land and the water. And the corresponding day, day 6, he fills the land with the living creatures on the land, including people. So you've got this pattern of parallel days, if you like, where he forms and fills, forms and fills, forms and fills. And that fits the clue that he gave us in chapter 1, verse 2, where he says, verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and we can talk about that if there's time. Now the earth was formless and empty, which is a really interesting Hebrew phrase, meaning essentially uninhabitable and uninhabited, unformed and unfilled. So right at the headline it says God created everything, but it wasn't a suitable environment to live in, and nothing was living in it. And then on days 1, 2, 3, he's forming the environment. He's effectively undoing that formlessness, and then he's filling it. It wasn't empty any longer because he was putting lights in the sky, things in the sea, animals and man on the land. So it's following this pattern that we get the clue from the phrase formless and empty, tohu vohu in Hebrew in chapter 2, which again tells me this isn't a lab book account. This is a carefully prepared account to tell us why do we live in the environment that we live in. Now, I think the main vehicle that he wants to talk about is God and us. But obviously, as you say, we need to start with the creation idea before we get on to what he really wants to talk about. So that's why I would say initially, textually, I find it hard to think of this as I've got no problem with Christians who want to take it that way. I think, I've held that position for a long time, but for me, this feels like it doesn't want to be taken as a step-by-step guide to creating a universe.
And that's so helpful, and it's really helpful that there's no, in what you're saying there's no obvious conflict that with science, because this is not a scientific document. It's not trying to do that. So why do some Christians, well, quite a lot of Christians, the reputation of Christians, insist on reading this as being an account of a young earth creation?
Several reasons again. Number one, I think when you read it initially, it does very much give you the impression that this is what happened if I was there watching. So I think it's an honest first reading of the book. He doesn't say at the start, guys, let me give you an allegory. He doesn't say, let me give you a poem that's going to describe it. He says, in the beginning, God created it, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. So I think I've got a lot of sympathy with that view. I think the reason that Christians tend to dig in on this, though, is because they're trying to defend the Bible. They've realized that there is this potential fault line in their faith, whereby if, for whatever reason, well-intentioned or less well-intentioned scientists can get in and demonstrate that the early chapters of Genesis are, quotes, wrong, then their whole Christian faith effectively falls apart, because then they would think, all right, the Bible's got faults in it. If I can't trust this, what can I trust? Maybe the truth that I believe about God through Jesus isn't true, and the whole thing goes. So I think it's a bit like the sort of crack in the dam, isn't it? If they concede ground on Genesis chapter 1, then the whole thing could come falling down. Which I've got sympathy. My approach, though, is if it's true, you can investigate it as much as you like, and you can dig in as much as you like, and it isn't going to come falling down. So I think let's dig in. And if it's not true, I'd rather find out now than later. So, I think it's worth looking at. But I think that's why people go for it. The third point, I guess, which is a supplementary one, is that it's difficult to decide if you read through Genesis, particularly Genesis 1 to 11, maybe 1 to 12, at what point does it move from being a kind of stylized sort of prose poem to being actual narrative history. And whilst it appears to be probably chapter 12 is the latest point you do that does raise sort of interpretive and philosophical questions for people.
Yeah, because the account of Genesis 1, the chapter of Genesis 1 is very different in tone and style to where we left off, is about to launch into chapter 2, which takes much more of a narrative form or written in prose. So the writer is writing intentionally historical fact, or things that the person's wanting us to read as being factual. But I guess even you'd say chapter 1's not without factuality. It's still a true account of creation. It's just perhaps not true in the sense that we mean it to be true, or we think about that.
I think it tells us true things within its own literary genre. I think it's in the same way that, and it's a much used illustration, but it bears staying the same. And if a poem talks about, the sun, or even if a scientist talks about the sun rising, No one's holding them to account for scientific blasphemy, because we know that actually, the earth is revolving around its own axis and around the sun. Nobody's confused when we say the sun rises. You just have to think, what do people mean when they say things? What was their intention of communicating, rather than sort of woodenly holding them to, no, you must have been speaking in a literal scientific description. So I would say it contains truth that God created everything that we have. He created it for a specific purpose, which I think we find out when we look at the description of man and woman being made in the image of God in verses 26, 27, and 28. And it tells us quite a lot of facts about God himself, which I think is the main intention of the author. I think he wants to communicate something about God more than he wants to communicate something about how everything came into existence. Because those two twin themes of forming and filling come out in the instruction to humankind. He talks about go forth, multiply, subdue the land and fill it. He's saying to the human being made in the image of God, I want you, man and woman, to replicate what I have been doing. I've been forming uninhabitable environments into ones that can be inhabited, and I've been inhabiting them with planets, stars, moons, fish, birds, animals, and people. Now I want you to replicate that. I want you to, if you like, head out into this wider world, and I want you to form it, I want you to make it inhabitable, and I want you to fill it with people, which is why the whole big deal about having children, which is a big Old Testament and Genesis theme, because it's how we image God. It's how we reproduce what God has done in the world. So I think he wants to tell us about people. What are we here for? We're here to make inhabitable and to inhabit this world as the image, as the representatives of God. And I think he's telling us about, and that's why I think he uses this forming and filling structure, because it flows naturally out of tohu wavohu. This is what we started with. This is what God has done. But on day 7, God's going to take a break. And actually, it's over to you guys. I want you now to continue this process of forming and filling, which is the storyline we see throughout the entire Bible, from the Garden of Genesis to the promised land of Canaan, to the gospel going out and filling the whole earth. He's teeing up the whole story, if you like. So that's what he wants to tell us about people. And what he wants to tell us about God is in contrast to everything you guys have learned when you were slaves in Egypt. If we assume for the moment this was written by Moses in the Exodus event, there is not a plethora, a kind of vast multitude of completing deities of all sort of different aspects of life, of the physical environment and phases of life and cities and everything. There's one God, and he's all powerful. That's what I think he wants us to read. We read in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and we home in on the details. Well, how did he do it? What was he like? The original hearers would just think, well, hang on a minute. I inhabit a world where there's a multitude of gods and deities around me. And the writer of Genesis wants to say to the Hebrews, do you know what? The actual truth is there's one God. And there's one God, not in tune with nature, not a manifestation of nature, not even kind of dominant over areas of nature and environment. There's one God who is so almighty and all powerful that when he speaks, everything that he wants to exist exists. It's an effortless act of creation, and such a God cannot be challenged by anything within his creation. So it's starting us off and starting them off with a view of God completely different to anything they'd known before. But of course, because our culture has been so thoroughly immersed in Judeo-Christian thinking, we're not surprised by that. We don't feel the punch of one almighty God created it. Wow. We just think, created it? Did he? I find that hard to believe. So I think that's one of the main things he's trying to get us to believe. It's a polemic, if you like, against other ancient Near Eastern deities. Even the idea of, says, he created the greater light and the lesser light for the day and night. He's deliberately not using the standard Hebrew names for the sun and the moon, Shamash and Sin, because those were also synonymous with the names of deities. He's making the point, no, don't think about these guys as deities. They're just big lights in the sky. and I made them, bang, without even trying anything. It's a polemic. It's picking up motifs and ideas from other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts and other ancient Near Eastern mythologies to show the hollowness of that kind of worldview, sort of supernatural worldview to say, no, actually, there's one God who made everything effortlessly. That's what I think he wants to communicate to us in chapter 1. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 communicate different things, but I think that's his prime aim.
That's great. That's fascinating as well, and I think really helpful for people. I mean, because I think for a lot of people growing up in a country like this, they dismiss Christianity quite early on the basis of being told at primary school, or maybe at Sunday school if they ever went, that, you know, being shown some pretty pictures of the Genesis story and Adam and Eve with fig leaves covering their private parts, and they immediately think, well, that's just a kid's story, that's ridiculous,
Yeah.
like Aesop's fable, we'll move on.
Yeah.
But even just the way you describe what the author's trying to communicate there has deep, I think, modern resonances as well for the way people think about the natural world, the created world.
Yeah.
He seems at the one hand to be despiritualizing the world, which again, and also I see the creation is outside of the creator, because we might not live in a world where we think that the moon and the sun are gods, but sometimes the way that we talk about the natural world is that we think it is a god, or it is, you know, we talk about the planet healing itself and the universe having intention and will for us, which there might be some interesting truth in a lot of those statements that we don't understand. But what I find quite fascinating is that as a society, I think there is a part of society that is atheistic and you know, just very literalistic. Science is going to take us home and give us everything we need to know. But increasingly, I talk to people who are quite monistic and see everything as one and everything as connected. Whereas this is almost also a polemic against that, because it's saying that the created world isn't divine, isn't God, the universe isn't all there is as well, but there's a being outside that spoke it into existence. And that's where I just come to the opening statement of the chapter, which I've heard described as being the most controversial verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Controversial because if that's true, then that radically reorients how we think about the world. Do we, in reading that, dismiss the Big Bang theory? Is that where you go with that? It's where a lot of people say Christians go with statements like that. How do you fit together a statement like that and what science tells us about how the universe came into existence?
I don't dismiss the Big Bang. I think there's a huge amount of very, very, very credible evidence to suggest that that is how the universe started. I think it's fascinating to look at. It's mind-stretching physics you get into in those kind of things. But I think it's given that it's regarded in the cosmological community as an established fact, not something that's, oh, is it, isn't it? One of my points is this, Jez. You've got to let people who are experts be experts, yeah. And it's, you know, I've got a degree in theoretical physics, great. I taught maths for a while, I teach the Bible. What kind of an idiot would I be to walk up to people in some of the best kind of astrophysics departments in the world and say, you guys have got it all wrong on this. You don't know, you don't know what's going on scientifically. That is arrogance of the highest order, and it's disgraceful. And these guys are brilliant in the work that they do. And we should be in awe of it, and we should love the view it gives us into the universe and existence. I think it's part of being made in the image of God that we want to find all this stuff out, and we're curious. So I don't reject modern cosmology in that sense. I've got slight questions over the multiverse theory, but that's a different, more philosophical issue. I think it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Bang. If you then read the rest of Genesis and here's how he did it and when, you run into a little bit of difficulty. If you read instead the rest of Genesis and let me tell you about the God who created it and why he created you, that's what he wants us to really home in on in this. So it says there, and it says in chapter 2, verse 4, this is the account of the heavens and the earth in the day God created them. It's like bookending it, saying, God did it. I believe God created it. Did he created it through a big bang? It looks like he did it at the moment. Do I hold Genesis up to say, but he can't because I've got a book that says he doesn't? No, because I don't think that's what he's dealing with there. I just think science is superb in so many ways. I think it's beautiful, it's creative, it's transformative in the way that we live, but I don't think science and the idea of the Big Bang or any other cosmological theories answer the question, why is life like this? And why do I feel the way I do? And why do I think or not think about God the way I do? And that's where I think we turn to the Bible, because that's what I think the writer of Genesis wanted us to deal with.
That's helpful, thanks. Well, I mean, there's several places I'd like to take this conversation, and you mentioned there in the Bible giving this answer to the question, why do I feel the way that I do? Why is human life the way that it is? Well, of course, science is increasingly answering that question for us through the discipline of an evolutionary anthropology, in explaining our makeup based on our experiences millions of years ago and the things that we had to learn and do to evolve and grow and become. So let's come on to talk. I mean, it might be a bit of a leap to go from Genesis 1 straight into Genesis 2 and 3, but we're not necessarily going to read it. But the concept of mankind and where we came from. You obviously, you're a big fan of science, but this does seem to be, as I understand it as well, for Christians, a stickier wicket or a trickier situation to work out what do we do about like macroevolution and the origin of the human species. What are your reflections on that?
Again, my reflections on that come out of a mixture of textual reading. What do I think the early chapters of Genesis want to tell me, rather than what do perhaps modern Christians want them to tell me, and also what does the modern scientific evidence suggest? As far as I can tell, there is a wealth of evidence for macroevolution as well as microevolution. I know Christians like to sort of split them in two, don't they, and hive them off. I think it's a pretty much established scientific fact, the kind of web of life, the interrelated development of less complex to more complex beings. My scientific background isn't in microbiology, so I would struggle a bit with some of the technical details, but to me it looks like there's a pretty strong consensus, including people I know who are Christians and who are very competent to analyze the information themselves. So I think that's a fair fact. I don't think that's particularly controversial. I don't think it contradicts particularly with the idea of God created them each according to their kind. He put that in specifically so that, 3,900 years later, we could say no to Charles Darwin's discoveries. I think he's just wanting us to know that he created these things and he created them here for a reason. The difficulty I have is when you then start talking about, okay, does that mean human beings are little more than, strategically shaved chimps? Are we very smart, hairless hominids? Well, to a certain extent, of course we are, fairly smart hominids. That's just a way of looking at us. But are we more than that? And again, I think that's why the opening 3 chapters of Genesis are so important to us. We talked about the kind of worldview and the science increasingly trying to provide this evolutionary answer. If you just leave it to the evolutionary answer and say, yeah, we all developed from kind of blobs of something floating around in the primordial ocean, and eventually we got here today. Why am I so special? Why do I matter? You don't, sorry. You're no more of interest to anybody than an earthworm or anything else. But that's not our experience of life, is it? We don't walk around feeling like, I don't look at my children and think, great, I've managed to reproduce genetically a couple of times. Yeah, job well done. There's all sorts of things that kick in, such as, a sense of love, a sense of meaning, a sense of, reaching out for something above and beyond ourselves in terms of significance. Most people, even though the evolutionary paradigm would say the significance is solely passing on your genes, most people don't get later on in life and say, I have successfully passed on my genes. I feel completely satisfied and fulfilled and can see out my later years, with equanimity. Most people are looking for still meaning, purpose, satisfaction, understanding about themselves. They're reaching out for something. And I think that's where Genesis 1, 2, and 3 kicks in. It's because I think there is a God who created us to be in relationship with him. And the Genesis account tells us we're supposed to feel this way, and we feel it because that connection we've got has been broken. So I think the evolutionary story is really great for telling me perhaps why certain bones in my pelvis are the way they are, or why my hands work in the way that they do, or why I've got, you know, certain kind of inbuilt reactions to kind of, you know, startling events. Why if I see a hose, oh, it's a snake. No, it's not a snake. And the whole limbic system. I think it's great at telling us lots of physiological things like that and some of the psychological things. But I think it struggles to answer the questions which I think Genesis 2 and 3 answer. Why do I feel like this? Why do I keep reaching out for something more? And why aren't I satisfied when I reach my goals, even though I thought I would be?
Let's talk about the fall of man then, because that's a major part of Christian theology, is that sin entered the world. I think as you've used the expression, we are eccentric people designed to center around God, but now we center around ourselves, or we insist on other people centering around ourselves, and that creates problems for us in the world, the like of which Genesis is trying to get to grips with and understand our lived experience. But then that does seem to pose a problem for the Christian story of the fall, where there was a time pre-fall where we were not sinful beings, and we did not have morality problems and, you know, crises of conscience, and now we do. And so help us understand some of the tensions and challenges there for Christians and non-Christians to think through.
That's a huge challenge to the Christian faith and to my worldview. It's on the one hand, it's very straightforward. The Genesis chapter 3 account, the account of humanity deciding they want to orient their lives around themselves rather than about God, and the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual, and the relational dysfunction that came as a result of that, is fairly straightforward. You read it as, this was the point that Pandora's box was open and a multitude of ills was let out into the world, never to be put back again yet. On the other hand, it's also a brilliant description of what happens every single day when people, including well-meaning Christian people like you and I, make wrong choices, when we choose our way over God, which is the point, I think, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So I think it's a brilliant description of what happens when we decide we want to personally orientate ourselves around ourselves rather than God, and the dysfunctions that follow from that. If it was only that, there would be, I don't think, any problem. I think it would be a brilliant kind of opening point. The difficulty comes, I think, when you start saying, but it really does look like, as you said, there was a point at which suddenly this spiritual, psychological, emotional dysfunction entered humanity. And the obvious question to ask people like me is, well, when did that happen? How did it happen? What was humanity like before that? At what point does someone become a human before that? And those are hugely difficult questions for me to give an answer to. And I would say I'm just not very sure how I would answer them.
And like you said, the text isn't answering those questions. And that's part of the challenge we've got. When we ask questions of the text that it's not trying to answer, then, you know, you may as well be talking to someone in French, because it's not fair to insist on a level playing field on issues that, and I think what's interesting is that this is a polemic, as you said, written to believing Hebrews, and putting their understanding of the world in terms that they understood and in terms that resonated deeply with them. And I think what would be interesting is to almost see a retelling, or a retelling or a fresh version for people in a society as scientifically oriented as ours. But I think some of the language that you've used then, even just to describe the human condition of experiencing that dissonance and brokenness on a day-to-day basis. Jordan Peterson, although not necessarily a traditional theist, but a very well-known and popular academic at the moment, interprets this psychologically and morally, and sees it as being an archetypal example of a story that gave understanding to human experience. And as he does that, he's very close to, you know, what I hear Christian preachers say, because that is in a large part of what this text is doing. The challenge, of course, is that Christ needed to come for the Christian, to come and rescue us from our condition, and that the condition was our fault rather than just being victims of evolution. There was willful choices on the part of early humans to distance ourselves from our creator and instead turn to our creation to satisfy us. And orient ourselves.
Yeah, I think the big mistake that many Christians make with Genesis chapter 3 is they look at it and say, that's what happened back then, and that's where all the problems come from. Whereas I think a large piece of it is wanting to say to us, that's what you do, and that's why things are going wrong for you, because you are out of step, you're out of harmony with God, you're out of harmony with who you are and who you were created to be. And you are now also out of harmony with other people and with the environment that you live in. I think it drives me around the bend when you hear Christians picking up Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and all they want to talk about is what happened back then, and why are we blamed for Adam doing this, that, and the other. And you think, no, that's not the Christian message. Christian message is you are Adam, you are Eve, you've done this, you do this, you are doing this. And that's why you're out of step with God, and that's why you desperately need God to somehow put things right. And then you get those beautiful couple of pictures at the end of chapter 3, where having been exiled, thrown out of the garden, God steps in to deal with it. I think it's important to remember Adam and Eve are pictured in this very much as, well, archetypal is one way of saying it, representatives is another way of saying it. I don't think the emphasis is because they did that, we're all in big trouble. I think the emphasis is because we all do that, we are in big trouble.
Wow, and you can totally see that. I love that. And for societies that are much more community oriented and they understand the interconnectedness of the generations, it makes a lot more sense, and it resonates deeply to talk about the representational heads of Adam and Eve. But I mean, I've not heard it put like that before. I find that so helpful for a individualistic society like ours that does think about the world in terms of me and my, to say to people, the point is you are Adam, you are Eve. Right. And actually, even as you said, if you lost the rest of the Bible but had Genesis 1 to 3, you would have a pretty good picture understanding the Christian message, and that this wasn't something that just happened then, that God then, after they sinned, God stepped in and brought in some consequences for their behavior, but also brought in some promise of reconciliation and repair for their behavior. And then he did that again in history in the person of his son on the cross. So it's very contemporary and it resonates deeply, certainly with me. And what's interesting is to get Paul on the show and to hear him talk about how it does or doesn't resonate with him would be quite an interesting conversation to have. A couple of things to ask you about before we finish our conversation today. One is the age-old question then of, and it may, maybe we can anticipate your answer from things that you've said, but the age-old question of why did God put a tree in the garden to trip people up? What's the point of that part of the story?
The tree of knowledge of good and evil you're talking about, you're not so interested in the tree of life at this stage.
That's true, yeah.
Okay.
That's a helpful distinction there, isn't it? Because that does, people instantly in asking the question do overlook the fact that God gave a tree of life as well as a tree of knowledge of good and evil.
I think you have to understand the two trees together, otherwise it doesn't quite make sense. If you just talk about the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that's the tree of the forbidden fruit. Don't eat any of that fruit, because if you are, you're going to die. That seems pretty arbitrary, doesn't it? It's like, it's like I'm going to put a lot of tins of beans in my cupboard. One of them I'm going to put anthrax in. Don't open it. You just think, what? The whole deal with the two trees is this. The tree of life was a well-established ancient Near East motif. It pops up all over the place as the idea that if we could find this tree, sometimes pictured as in the center of the world, and I can eat from it, I either become immortal or I'm alive, I'm cured, I'll get to an old age, that kind of thing. It was an established motif. What it's doing, I think, in Genesis 2 and 3 is it's telling us we are mortal. It's this whole thing about if you eat from the other tree, which we are getting to in a second, dust you are, to dust you'll return. The idea of dust is just an idea of mortality in Genesis 2. In the pictorial way, God molds the man out of the dust of the earth. It's to the original readers, you read it as an ancient Hebrew and you're thinking, yeah, I'm mortal, because when I die, in that hot kind of dry environment, you desiccate. You don't rot or get eaten by the worms. You just turn to crumble into some bones with some dust around them. So the whole idea is we're mortal. He's told us, I've created you from the dust, therefore you are mortal. Here's the tree, which if you eat from this tree, you will live. Not here's the vaccine for death. Here's the, if one bite from an apple from this tree or whatever, pomegranate, whatever it was, I'm going to live forever. I think it's more of you need to keep eating from this to sustain life, because you yourself, Adam, are mortal, you're dust. So there's this idea that we've got to keep feeding on the tree of life. Now, what's the other tree going on there? The other tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is if you like, so the tree of life tells you this is what you need. You need God to survive. We are designed to be dependent secondary creatures, feeding on God, if you like, by faith. And you can develop that in the New Testament in all sorts of ways, feeding on Christ, etc. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what's that about? It's not just knowing about the concept of good and evil. Otherwise, when he says to them, here's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they're like, what do you mean? What are those words? It's and in chapter 3, when Adam's and Eve have eaten from it, and God says to them, oh, hang on, you know, they've become like good and evil, like knowing good and evil, like one of us. So it's not experiencing or doing evil eating from the tree. It's what does God do with good and evil that we are not allowed to do? And I think what it's telling us is God is the one who determines what's good and evil. God's knowledge of good and evil is not just, I've worked it out, I've looked at the reference works and found out. It's like God says, no, I'm the one who determines what's good and evil. And when the humans, the man and the woman, eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what they're actually saying is, despite what you've said, God, I am going to choose for myself what is right and wrong. I'm going to determine my own morality. And the reason there's two trees is because God's telling us you can't have both. You can't continue to eat from the tree of life, to draw your sustenance and your life and your being from God, if you're rejecting God by saying, no, I'm going to take the place of God in deciding what I think is right and wrong. And for that, and I still haven't answered your question, but I will. So, and for that reason, I think this is such an important, powerful picture for our culture today, because if you like, one of the dominant ideas in our culture is, don't tell me what's right and wrong. I feel this is the right thing to do for me. I can't, it's this sense of, no, don't get some old book or some God who's he just come up with the arbitrary rules. It's not about arbitrary rules. It's about living in harmony and drawing life from him, eating continually from the tree of life. But we can't do that if we choose to replace him with ourselves as the source of moral authority and right and wrong. So that's the deal with the two trees. If that makes sense, I could then answer why you put the tree in the garden.
I think that's really helpful. Yeah, thank you so much. Go on then, you can answer the second question.
Well, I don't really know is the answer. In one sense, it's a very, as we said before, it's like leaving a hand grenade in a child's ball pit, isn't it? It's just someone's going to get hurt eventually. But I think the point it's doing literally in the account is it's telling us not back then there was a special tree. Oh, don't touch that one. What it's doing is that's telling us right here and now, you are Adam and Eve. You need to make a choice. You need to choose how you're going to respond to God. Are you going to draw your life and health and strength and meaning from him by eating from the tree of life? Or actually, you're going to choose to overstep the moral boundaries he's put and therefore lose the connection with God himself. I think it's there symbolically in the account to tell us that you and I every day need to make a choice. How am I going to respond to God? How am I going to react to what he's done? And if you say, well, don't put the tree of life, to put the tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden because it's dangerous. Well, actually, I need something to tell me every single day I run the risk of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Every day I run the risk of doing things that break or put into disharmony my relationship with God. It's there in the book to tell us, guys, watch out. It's possible to really sort of wreck your connection with God through taking his place.
That's good. That's good. It's a really good answer. Next question, last question as we close. I know one of the comments that my friend Paul, who you'll be talking to, often makes is about that statement to be made in the image of God. As we've talked about it over the years and tried to explain, I think he still feels like this sounds like an incredibly egotistical way of thinking about the human species, that we are somehow more special than all these other things that live around us. And I think for him that becomes one of those things that I want to say a stumbling block, but certainly something that turns him off from the idea of faith, because it just makes the Bible, in his view, look like, of course, human beings would write this book and say, oh, we happen to be the image of God. We happen to be the most special thing in the universe. Help me
Yeah, okay.
understand that phrase, the image of God, and perhaps a different way of thinking about it than we said there.
First thing I would say on the image of God is, I think if humans were writing this book, we wouldn't have written ourselves as the image of God. We would put ourselves as the gods. I think we love to actually be top of the tree. However much humility we want to put on it, I think we always like to put ourselves right at the top. Secondly, I would say that everybody, and I'm sure your mate does exactly this, in practice lives as if we are different to other animals, to other people. He will be, as I would be, as any right-thinking person would be, much more upset if a child died than if a pet died, even though we'd be upset by the pet, and we'd be much more willing to sacrifice, if you want, for want of a better word, a tree and all the insects living in it than a house and all the people living in it. So philosophically, I get the point that isn't this an awful thing to put us above everything else when we know we're part of this continuity of evolutionary progression. But I would say in practical, real terms, everyone I've ever met acts on the implicit assumption that actually people do matter a little bit more than other things. In terms of what this image of God means, I think you could definitely read it as, hey, this is great, made in the image of God. Oh, this is tremendous. But I don't think that's the feel of the passage. I don't think the passage is saying, good news, guys, there was a kind of a creational or environmental lottery and you guys won the jackpot. You are absolutely you're the best of the best of the best. Congratulations, there's the image of God, there's a badge. I think if you read it, it's talking about responsibility. And I think particularly if you read it in the context of chapters 1, 2, and 3, a responsibility that many people in some ways would rather not have. So he creates humanity, man and woman, in the image of God, and immediately gives them this instruction, gives them the creation mandate, people, Christians refer to it as, to subdue the earth, to fill it. He's saying, I want you to do a specific thing with your life to extend the work of God. There's a great privilege in that I'm working with God on something, but there's a great responsibility, because if I say, what I actually want to do with my life, God, is go off to a nice sunny beach in the Pacific Ocean and dedicate it to painting sunsets, God will say, well, actually, I've called you to something else. I've got responsibility for you to, as it puts it here, to rule over the created environment, which again, it was very much misused in the, jump back a few centuries, and it was the phrase, horribly misused by people to subjugate other people groups, to steal other people's countries, to nick their national resources, to trash the physical environment, to exploit terribly the wildlife. No, I'm ruling over it, I'm ruling over it. But if we're in the image of God, we're supposed to rule over the created environment in the way that God does. And if God rules over it by trashing it, maybe we trash it. But if God rules over it by caring for it, and Jesus talks about not one sparrow falls to the ground outside of God knows it. He knows every hair on your head. He's intimately involved in love and care for his environment, and he wants us to replicate that. So I would say this is not a, I've got the medal and I get to do whatever I like. I think I've got a grave responsibility to look after the world, the created environment, the creatures in it, and most importantly, the other people in it, which is why I can't nip off to the Pacific Island and just sit on the beach all day, because I've got a God-given responsibility to try and make the world a better place for the people living in it, to speak up for the poor and needy and the vulnerable, and to do whatever we can to help them reconnect with God and reconnect to the kind of life that God wants us to have, rather than the life that some of us have.
That's great. I mean, I think that's a really helpful answer. Just one thought that comes to mind, I'm sure it wouldn't be the first person to think this or put this to you, is if we're supposed to rule and govern and steward the creation in the manner that God does, it could be argued that when you look at our planet, it seems to be that it by and large is put under quite a bit of chaotic, painful, turbulent treatment with fires and earthquakes, tsunamis, and even the seasons, and just a constant cycle of death and destruction, and
Yeah.
nature's red in tooth and claw and all of that. So you could argue, by looking at evolutionary structure, how God engineered the development of the species, that is how God rules.
Yeah.
What is
Yeah,
your...
you definitely could, and that would be a really, really strong point against what I've said. I would embed my answer in the Genesis 1, 2, and 3 account. So in other words, you look at this idea of the garden and this unformed, unfilled world. It says in it, chapter 1, create the heavens and the earth, the land, if you like, was formless, was unformed and empty, unfilled. Then God forms and fills certain environments and instructs mankind to do the same. If you take the kind of classic six-day view of the world, that God created the world and it was perfect the world over, it was a beautiful utopian tropical paradise, what actually is he asking these two guys to do? It's all done, isn't it? If you take a different view, that God's purpose in creating the world was not, I'm going to create heaven on earth, and then I'm going to wreck it when people sin, and then give them a really hard time. But you take the view that actually God was creating a microcosm in the garden of, this is a wonderful utopian existence, but I want you to extend this out into the rest of the created environment, which is uninhabitable and uninhabited. It's not safe and fit for people to live in. Then you've got something that I think that fits better with the storyline of it. They're excluded from the garden by the sweat of your brow. You'll do earth, thorns and thistles. It's all going to be painful and difficult. That God is saying, yeah, you look at the world and you do think this looks pretty rough and difficult. But God's saying that's not my final intention for it. My intention is through partnering with human beings, forming and filling with me, ruling with me, I want together to get to the point where we've created this wonderful utopian existence, which the New Testament then tacks on, if you like. Actually, that won't be fully achieved in this life. That'll be in the creation to come. But you look at humanity over the last few thousand years, there are grave problems facing us, but there's a whole load of stuff that doesn't cut us down in the way it used to be. You look at life expectancies a few thousand years ago, you might be lucky to get 45, something like that. Human creativity, often through scientific advances, have created a world that in many places, but not all, is significantly safer and more conducive to flourishing than it used to be. Because I think we're kind of partnering with God in that. That isn't a fully satisfactory answer, but it's a kind of a partial response to the excellent question that you raised.
Well, no, I think it is a good answer, because it's an answer that's embedded within the story that we've been looking at. It's embedded within your way of seeing the world. And actually, everybody needs to reconcile their questions about the world with their overarching narrative and story that they believe about the world. And so one pushback to perhaps a more atheistic reading of the world and of evolution is just simply the statement that, why would you expect life to be any easier than it actually is? When things are hard and you complain about it, what is there in the created world that tells you should expect things to be easy? Or that you'd expect the universe, the creation, to be on your team, backing your corner? Because you're right, it feels like a wild, restless place that is needing human governance and stewarding to bring it into order.
Yeah, or even more, if you want it to be even more perhaps bolshy, why do you care? All right, I expect it to be difficult and unpleasant because of evolutionary stuff, but why do you care? Why does that matter? Why does it matter if we all are just a little, combination of genetic material that's passing on our genetic material? Why does it matter that it is a horrible place to live in? Why do we care when children get childhood diseases? Why do we care, when people struck down in their prime? Why do we care when the natural environment is destroyed? Why do we care when animals are mistreated? I think it's because there's a residual seed in us that knows we're supposed to be looking after this. This isn't the way life really is supposed to be, and we're supposed to be doing something about it. I think
that's brilliant. Rich, this has been so helpful. There's been so much good stuff in here. I'm so grateful for your time and putting all that out there.
No
any
worries.
final comments or thoughts?
yeah, I would just say, when you read, biblically speaking, read Genesis 1 to 3 and read it and say, what do I think the author really wanted me to understand by this? What was the original writer wanting to tell me, not what do I think this is a book written about? And when you do that, I think you discover there's a lot more in there than tedious pub arguments about how old is the earth, or, where do Adam and Eve's other children come from?
Mm. Which is a good question. Where do they come from? But maybe a question for another time.
Yeah, and also I'd just chuck in one more thing. Beware unspoken assumptions. There's a whole load of assumptions we bring, particularly if we've got a Christian background, to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, that we assume it's there. And when you say, well, where is that in the text? It's not there. Even weird things like let there be light, there was light. Does that mean that was when he created photons, electromagnetic radiation? Or does it just mean it was dawn that particular day? Particularly as it follows it, doesn't it? And there was evening, there was morning the first day. When it says in chapter 2, no rain had fallen on the ground, does that mean rain as a phenomenon had never existed? Or does it just mean it was before the start of the spring rains in that environment? There's loads of things that we bring to it, assuming, there's no one else, just Adam and Eve. Well, does it say that?
Mm.
So beware the unspoken assumptions.
Brilliant. Well, there we go. What do you think? I found that particularly helpful, and I think everything you had to say was really very interesting. I look forward to hearing what Paul's going to say in reply. Thanks so much for being with us for this episode. I hope you found the content helpful. Hope you've learned something. I hope you've been challenged. And I hope that you've enjoyed your time listening to Rich and my conversation. I look forward to hearing from you and seeing you all soon. God bless. Goodbye.